This is October 26, 2025 at 12:30 p.m. My name is Wade Frazier. I'm going to do an experiment with doing video presentations of my work. This is something that I haven't done before. I did an video interview this past summer. I thought it went well with some Green Party activists, and it inspired me to do this. And in fact, this has been a long time dream of mine to be able to tell orally what I think is worth telling. And this is a long-term project, so we'll see how this goes. Right now, I'm posting this on YouTube, probably go on Rumble. YouTube is notorious for deleting accounts such as mine, so we'll see if my account lasts at YouTube or not. So I guess the bottom line is that I have been pursuing what I now understand to be the biggest event in the human journey. And I've been doing this for pretty much my whole lifetime. I got my dreams when I was 15 years old. Here I am, 67 today. And again, I had adventures and experiences that actually most people find hard to believe. And some of my fellow travelers, their experiences are much more unbelievable than mine. And the problem is relating those experiences to the people that we seek. And the people that I seek, I think, will see a lot of their experiences in mine. And so hopefully this will assist in their connecting to my material, because the stories I'm about to present and the material I'm about to present we'll see how long this takes. It might take a long time, not many videos. It'll resonate with them, and they will be able to help with this biggest event in the journey, which is, in short, a world of abundance, bring a world of abundance into being. And the only way that can happen is with abundant, harmlessly produced energy. And this is something that I'll get into over the course of these videos. My writings, I've been writing since 1996. I have thousands and thousands of pages of material that covers all this territory, complete with lots of documentation, etc. And so this can be the video version. I may present documents in this if I can figure out how to do it. Right now I'm using Zoom for this. And so anyway, we'll see how it goes. So, I've been thinking about how I'm going to present this, what I'm going to do for this first video. I think I need to do a broad overview of this. And so I'll try to make this pretty short, as short as I can. And the bottom line is that my first professional mentor invented an engine which was considered the best engine in the world for powering an automobile. A federal study concluded that. And in fact, only a second patent on it, the government claimed rights to it, et cetera. And this was, again, it was a big deal. And it started making the news when I was 15 years old. And I got my dreams to change the industry back then when I was 15. What could I do about it at age 15? I had no idea, but it was a dream that I had. And I got to pursue it. And so I should be grateful that I actually had a chance to pursue it. And therein lies quite an odyssey. When I was 16, the next year, my parents actually sent me to Europe for a couple of months. Actually, it was the same year as I got my dreams. I was 15 to 16. It was 1974. And at the end of that year, and I was a scientist in training from the time I could walk. I was a bookworm. I memorized the books my parents read me when I was, 18 months old. And so I was all in these gifted programs that said I was supposed to be this scientist, this high-flying scientist. And what happened was that when I was 12, actually, what happened was the first thing that sort of woke me up to, let's say, alternatives to the mainstream pronouncements was my father had artery disease. In fact, pretty advanced, and he was only 33 years old. And went to his doctor. What can I do? He had a very high stress job working for the U.S. Navy at the time. And back then in 1970, the doctor said, "We can't do anything for you. You know, you can take some nitroglycerin tablets, but likely is that you're gonna, succumb to a heart attack or something." And my father ended up obtaining a booklet from his aunt, and the title was "Stale Food versus Fresh Food: The Cause and Cure of Arterial Sclerosis." And it was a book by a scientist from Arkansas. And his primary thesis was that processed food was the cause of hardening of the arteries, and that fresh food, whole food, was the cure. And so when I was 12 years old, up until that time, I had eaten like the average American. In fact, wrecked my dental health, et cetera, by age 10 with crowding and the shrinking of my jaw, these kinds of things, which is typical with people who eat processed food. And so, but we went to fresh food, and we lived in Southern California at the time, so it was easy, year-round produce. And so we became, quote, health nuts. And so, and in 2 years, my father had a complete health miracle, completely reversed all of his health problems. In fact, he later said it was the healthiest he ever was. And so this was my introduction to something that was not mainstream. In fact, in the next decade, that book was actually banned in the United States for being contrary to informed medical opinion. And the irony is that the informed medical opinion was completely false, wrong. And in fact, the advice in that booklet today forms the first line of defense of orthodox medicine, which is dietary and lifestyle changes. Imagine that. So, but when I was 12 years old, it was just, I wasn't thinking in terms of a medical racket or anything. I was just thinking in terms of, here's some way to be healthy, which some pioneers had stumbled upon. And so, but I later learned that bad for business to have people healthy with the medical industry. And this is something that, but I didn't learn that aspect of it till a generation later. But it was really my first introduction to alternative ways of being, acting. And when I was 16, my father ended up enrolling my family in a meditation class. This is Southern California, so this is pretty typical in those days. This is 1974. And we sat in a class that taught you to meditate, but using very scientific principles of brain waves and controlling them. They had what are today called biofeedback devices. As you can see, you actually measure, how you really alter your brain waves by meditating, etc. And at the end of that 40-hour class, everybody did these exercises, which is essentially, I guess today called remote viewing. And I watched somebody do remote viewing with somebody I knew, never met him. And it was amazing. One of the most amazing moments of my life was watching this woman identify somebody she never met by saying the end of his finger was chopped off and he was black. And my life was never the same after that. And then, in fact, then it was my turn to do the exercise. And some woman I never met, I diagnosed her as having a stroke that paralyzed the right side of her body. After, again, 20 hours of training. And and I never saw the world the same way again. And in fact, 5 years later, a man who eventually became my colleague, he was an astronaut named Brian O'Leary. He was in the physics department at Princeton at the time, and he took a human potential class in 1979. And he had the same remote viewing experience, describing somebody he'd never met in great detail, which was all spot on. And he was never the same. In fact, that ruined him as a mainstream scientist. In fact, my experience at age 16 ruined me as a mainstream scientist before I ever started. And so anyway, but I didn't know that at the time, that that was my fate, was that I wouldn't become a professional scientist. And so what happened was about 3 years later, I was going down the scientific track. In fact, also, I lived in a military household in a military community in the world's greatest empire. And I was trained, to be a soldier, just like my whole family was. All the way up my family tree was all soldiers going back, 100 years. And so anyway, actually I applied for the Air Force Academy, was nominated to go to the Air Force Academy until my mother, thank God, prevailed on my father to talk me out of doing that, because she saw what happened to my father when he became a soldier, came back quite a mess. Men don't come back from war normal. And so anyway, and so she had him tell me I wasn't going to go to the Air Force Academy. And so I just went to the local college. I was going to be a chemist, some kind of scientist, but I thought chemistry, biochemistry, microbiology, something like that. And again, what at age 17, 18, what really do you know what you want to do, right? So anyway, so what happened was that my second year of college, I had my first existential crisis. And I watched my chem professor, in my labs, walking through the labs in his white coat. He was probably my age, maybe I am today. I looked at him and I thought, that's going to be me. And I looked around and I was like, I really want to become a chemist. And so anyway, so I had a existential crisis where I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And what happened was, again, I was only, 19 years old. And what happened was, after a couple of months of kind of flailing around, seeking a direction, for the first time in my life, I've only done it twice. First time in my life, I actually went to bed one night and prayed with all my might to some higher power to give me a clue. And I didn't know what to do. And so I fell into a dreamless sleep. And then when I woke up the next morning, when I opened my eyes, there was this voice inside my head. It wasn't some people hear a voice, but it wasn't a voice. It was alien thoughts in my head that said, "Never thought about studying business." And it was a completely alien thought. I had no idea. I didn't know you could study business. I didn't know what it even meant. And so actually, but I was enthused because this voice came out of nowhere and made this suggestion. So I called my college and I asked them, "Can you study business? Can you study business in college?" And they said, "Oh, yeah, sure. Come, we have, programs for that, et cetera. And we'll set up a meeting with a counselor." And I became a CPA from that. And so anyway, and I was always top of my classes and record test scores and all this kind of stuff. What happened was I got out of college. And actually, I wanted to live in the Northwest where I'm from to hike a lot. I didn't care about my curl that much, but I got out of college in the worst recession in 40 years. And so I ended up working in Los Angeles at one of the big accounting firms. And I did that for about 3 years. And those are my life's unhappiest years. And I eventually realized I'm a professional was worthless. Auditing, again, there was a conflict of interest where the company being audited hires their auditors. Well, the auditors can't render independent opinions if that's the case. And it's still that way. Auditors are kind of worthless. If the people that are auditing pay their wages, how it can't be independent. You can't run an independent opinion if they do that. But it's the whole entire profession is still based that way. After the accounting scandals, and they keep being these accounting scandals because of this, and the savings and loan scandal was sort of like the death knell for those good old days. In fact, there were 8 of these big public accounting firms, and I was in them. And today there are half as many, 4. In fact, Arthur Andersen, which I actually interviewed at a few times, they went out of business. The Enron was actually the last scandal they were involved with. And but I was actually audited the savings and loans that they audited previously, which was one of the biggest scandals of what became the savings loan scandal back in the 1980s. And I was this idealist. I was this kind of Boy Scout. I was always a Boy Scout from the time I was born. And in fact, in our first post audit season class, training class, you could ask a partner whatever you wanted to anonymously. And I put my question in the basket, which was, well, how do we benefit society? And anyway, the partner actually read that question out, and there was about 30 of us in the room, and everybody breaks out laughing. And I sort of laughed also because it was so kind of out of context for the setting, let's say, because everybody was wondering how much do you make, and all this kind of, there's all this self-interested kind of questions. And I was asking the question of, do we really benefit society? And it turned out we didn't. And that was a question nobody wanted to hear. And so and I didn't understand that until several years later when the savings and land scandal broke. And I realized that the book cooking that I was watching this bank do, which was the world's biggest savings loan at the time, they're all doing it. And all the auditors were just signing off on these basically phony financial statements. And that was, again, the accounting profession had a huge black eye from that. And in fact, Enron, 15 years later, Enron happened, another huge black eye. And so auditors, they keep trying to make auditors, accountable, give them some teeth, et cetera. But the fact is their clients still hire them. But anyway, so what happened though was that I was this vegetarian. I was vegan actually for a while. But in Los Angeles, I was forced to eat meat, eating restaurants, and drinking alcohol. It was like part of your professional grooming, which was killing me. And so anyway, after about 3 years of that, I felt trapped in Los Angeles, trapped in my career. And for the second time in my life, I prayed with all my might for some guidance. And I had already tried 3 times to move back to my home city of Seattle before that. And what happened was I couldn't make it. Back then, it was before Microsoft and Amazon, et cetera. It was pretty much just Weyerhaeuser and Boeing back then. And well, anyway, so what happens is that I go to bed, pray with all my might for the second time in my life. In fact, the last time I'd done that. And the next morning, it wasn't as dramatic as the first time, but in the first half hour, a little voice in my head just said, "Why don't you move to Seattle now? What do you got to lose?" So it was just like this complete revelation. The clouds parted. Yeah, that was on a Tuesday. And I called my supervisor and I said, I'm out of here. I was already leaving. And so anyway, and by Saturday, I was driving up to Seattle, and then only been in town a couple of days to get my resume together and stuff. And I was determined as long as it took. And by that time, I had the credentials that I could find work rather easily. And anyway, so what happened was that I immediately went and saw a recruiter, and he said, "Oh yeah, your resume, don't worry about, we'll find something you like real fast." But the next morning, like less than 1 business hour, I got a phone, woken up that next morning by the phone call from this recruiter I had talked to at 4 p.m. the previous day. And he said, "Can you be ready this afternoon for an interview with a solar company?" And when he said solar company, it was like a lightning bolt hit me. And because I had my dreams of changing the energy industry since I was 15 years old, that dream looked further away than ever with how my career was going, my life was going. And so when it said solar company, it was like a lightning bolt. I mean, in fact, the lightning bolt still reverberates almost 40 years later. And so anyway, so I went to the interview that afternoon at a company in Seattle. And this is where and there was my second interview is when I met a man named Dennis Lee, who was the owner of this company. And this is the beginning of my big adventures. I had an eventful life until that. I had quite an eventful life before that, but when I met Dennis Lee, it was the next big chapter of my life. And this was in March of 1986. And I was just on fire. there were no other contenders for this job. And anyway, so I got hired by Dennis, and my job was to reconstruct the books of this company that was being put out of business by the local power structure in Washington State. And what the situation was, and this is something I didn't learn until I became Dennis's partner the next year, but he was selling the world's best heating system. In fact, it still is the world's best heating system. And he was putting on customers' homes for free using Jimmy Carter's energy tax credit. And so, yeah, in fact, it's the most brilliant and benevolent business strategy I ever saw. I mean, I've never seen anything as brilliant and benevolent as what Dennis was doing. And so what he said, and the basics were, he would sell a $10,000 heat pump, which had these huge evaporator panels which interacted with the environment, which increased its efficiency over your standard air heat pumps by a factor of 3. And it reduced your energetic cost of heating by more than 50% over gas and oil. And he was in an all-electric state in Washington because of all the cheap energy from the hydroelectric projects. But the biggest municipal bond default in United States history at that time created a big problem for the Washington utilities, and they started advertising energy conservation, electricity conservation. And Dennis, again, that's another conversation with Dennis. He's the Indiana Jones of the free energy field. And Dennis was on the East Coast, surviving murder attempts from the mafia, having his company stolen and stuff. Ended up in his home state back in 1983. And anyway, he believed these full-page ads from electric companies about energy conservation, and his heat pump would save about 85% of the heating costs or the electric costs of baseboard electric, which so many homes in Washington were, because it's an all-electric state, because it was 1 penny per kilowatt hour before this bond default, the cheapest electricity in the world. And so, in fact, Dennis was from Yakima, Washington originally, and so he really couldn't do this in his home state until that happened. You couldn't sell energy conservation equipment to the place where the energy costs were the cheapest in the world. And so anyway, and what happened was he thought they would love him. He believed the full-page ads, and he was putting, again, his program was so brilliant, so benevolent. And what he did was he sold a $10,000 heating system, and Jimmy Carter's tax credit would refund the buyer $4,000 on their tax return. In fact, it was refundable, so they were assured of getting $4,000 back on their tax return. So their down payment was refunded for them, and so the $6,000 remaining balance was only paid from their proven energy savings. And again, since it saved 85% of the heating costs in an all-electric home and about maybe 70% over a gas or oil heating, it would pay for itself, pretty quickly. And so, Dennis sold thousands of these heat pumps over the years, and mostly on the East Coast. And anyway, and so what happened was that the local power structure regarded Dennis as this dire threat, because if Dennis carpeted Puget Sound with these heat pumps, all the electric companies saw was billions of dollars in lost revenues. And so, yeah, there were full-page ads and stuff just for shows, all propaganda. And so when something came along that really would save energy like big, that was unacceptable, so it had to be wiped out. In fact, when I met Dennis, the day I met Dennis, he had a bodyguard from all the death threats he had. He actually survived a murder attempt there in Seattle. And hitmen were sicked on the company, corrupt public officials, smeared in the media. The bankruptcy courts. I mean, it was a full court press by all the assets of the electric companies to take the company out. And it was successful, wiped the company out, although Dennis still was able to install 400 systems, which actually that's what I did the accounting for, is the 400 systems that he did sell. And I didn't know that I was, reconstructing the records of what I believe was the greatest attempt ever made to bring alternative energy to the American marketplace. And I didn't know all that when I was just putting his books together as this young junior woodchuck who was 27 years old. And so anyway, but a few months later, Dennis gets his company stolen. In fact, my boss, controller and engineer of the theft, was some Mormon grifters. And so actually the first Mormon encounter. In fact, we had a bunch of Mormon, our company was probably half Mormon employees. And they hired their own, et cetera. And then these Mormon grifters stole, in fact, they stole Dennis's financier's company 2 weeks before they stole Dennis's company as a way to steal Dennis's company because his financier owned 10% of the company. Anyway, long, crazy story. And that was actually the happiest year of my life, 1986, because I was all in. I was like, and I didn't even know how the heat pump worked when I chased Dennis out of the state, when I chased after him later that year after his company was stolen. And but I started learning fast. And again, I have a scientific background and math, et cetera. You know, all these gifted programs, et cetera. So anyway, it was none of it was a heavy intellectual lift for me to understand it. And that's even then, though, it took me a while to study thermodynamics and a lot of physics and stuff to understand why it was the world's best heating system and why my mentor's engine was the best engine of the world for powering an automobile. And this happened years later. But what happened was when Dennis's company was stolen, it was running out of the state, and he ended up going to Boston to rebuild. And I chased him out there. He couldn't get rid of it. In fact, he tried to talk me out of chasing him, but I wouldn't be dissuaded. So I just said, "You got a floor for me to sleep on. I'm going to help you rebuild this thing." And when I got there, long story, but what happened was that he had a multi-millionaire who was going to put in $1 million to get it going again. In fact, what happened was the day after I arrived in Boston, and this is now November 1986, Dennis started thinking in terms of free energy. In fact, the day I met him, he spoke at the Seattle Center in front of about 1,000 people, announcing his intention to produce electricity to compete with the electric companies. At that time, Dennis didn't know what technology could do that, and that was kind of his pursuit. And so in Boston, he encountered a company that was making electricity from low temperature hot water. And the temperature was about the same temperature as the exhaust of his heat pump, about 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And Dennis got the idea of marrying his heat pump up to these low temperature turbines and making free energy. His original idea was kind of naive, but what happened was that I became his partner because the other guy pulled out when he realized Dennis was planning on ruffling the system. I came in when we were almost homeless. In fact, our rent check was going to bounce, and I came through and I raised the money to become Dennis's partner. And my mentor became my biggest investor in this operation. And what happened was I brought him out a couple months later to see if is Dennis smoking dope or is this something that really will work? And he was not quick to call it impossible. And in fact, later on, he proposed that marrying Dennis heat pump with his heat engine could do free energy. This was later on. And so and what happened was that we immediately started putting on these shows. In fact, Dennis, the showman, they called it the greatest energy show on earth. And he had a white tuxedo. You know, in fact, the first show he had was at the Old South Meeting Hall in Boston, where they staged the Boston Tea Party. This was the meme that Dennis was getting with, and this goes back to his nationalistic kind of ideals, which I don't share, but I get it. You know, and Dennis was appealing to that, and we started putting on these shows. And what happened was we stumbled into the middle of another nuclear energy controversy. That's the municipal bond default in Washington State was over nuclear power plants that never got built. And there was in Boston, there was this called Seabrook Power Station, which was right on the border of Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And in fact, Mazo Dukakis ran for president right around that time. And he got a lot of political mileage out of that because Massachusetts could block that power plant from going online because they had to approve the evacuation plans because it was within 10 miles of the power plant. And so anyway, we later heard in fact, while we were there, that the New England's electric companies had secret meetings on what to do about us, like they did in Washington, like they did in Washington State. But New England was like, maybe we got to work with these guys. And so anyway, so we actually held a show a quarter mile from the front gates of the Seabrook facility, and Dennis actually made a proposal to buy it out and have it be a thermal storage device for storing energy for Dennis's free energy devices. Anyway, it was kind of funny. And Dennis had an audience though with the chairman of the board of the Seabrook Association, et cetera, and they were kind of placate him, et cetera. But a couple months after I became Dennis's partner, and we were in this hole-in-the-wall office there in Woburn, Massachusetts. And anyway, some guys came to our office, some nondescript businessmen, and they offered us $10 million for our idea. And when I became Dennis's partner, I was actually fasting because it was cheaper than eating. And so in fact, it was my longest fast of my life. I did a 45-day fast, just drinking apple juice for 45 days straight because it's cheaper than eating. I had like $2 a day. And I was, anyway, when I became his partner, Dennis, when I asked Dennis if I raised the money, I could become his partner, he sort of laughed at me because I was fasting because it's cheaper than eating. And I didn't come with $1 million, but I came with enough to get us going. And what was I with that? Getting old here. Let me think about this for a second. Oh, so these nondescript businessmen show up to our office. And anyway, and they offer us $10 million. I'd been an instant millionaire. But that wasn't the program. But it sure was kind of strange. And anyway, then what happened was that a decade later, I hear from Tom Bearden. I went to a conference that he spoke at in Seattle, 1998. And I learned from Tom, I didn't present my case to him, although I did talk with Tom a little bit, that what we had received, that $10 million offer, was the standard friendly buyout offer. And so this is really, really typical. We didn't know it at the time. In fact, I didn't know it was a free energy field at the time. In fact, I had never heard of Nikola Tesla at the time. We were really, really ignorant of that. We didn't come to the free energy issue via Tesla and Moray and that kind of stuff. We came through the business route, and again, super heat pumps and world's best engine, et cetera. And so it was a different route. And so I was very ignorant of what we were stumbling into. And so in 2000, to fast forward to 2004, this astronaut colleague, Brian O'Leary, we became colleagues in free energy began back in 2003, 2004. In fact, till his death, I became Brian's biographer eventually. But Brian hosted, first thing we did was put on a conference, which I'll get to that later on. I don't think they work. I don't think that's really the best medium for trying to get something going. And so because there's, with 1,000 people in the audience, maybe 2 have the proper motivation. The rest of them are there for the other reasons. And so anyway, one of the speakers at that conference was a man named Stephen Greer. He's really famous in UFO circles, et cetera. In fact, his whole thing is UFOs and exotic technologies such as free energy, anti-gravity, et cetera. They're all joined at the hip. And we discovered this. We discovered this before we ever heard of Stephen Greer. And so this is where, again, we were learning through the seat of our britches, learning the hard way about how the world really works. And so anyway, so Greer, when he spoke at this conference in 2004, actually, I was manning the registration table. I had my wife man it while and that was the only break I took to listen to him speak for about an hour and a half. And anyway, I'm glad I did. And one of the things he said, I believe it was at that meeting that he said that in the early 90s, when he was briefing the head of the CIA on the UFO issue, because the head of the CIA was out of the loop and the presidents were out of the loop. And these are all subjects I will cover at length in the future. He actually interacted with the faction of the global elite, people who really run the world, who aren't presidents and billionaires, that those guys are all the way down the food chain. And so anyway, what they told him back in 1992 or three or something is that they had paid out $100 billion in quiet money, which is mostly these friendly buyout offers. In fact, they had paid out 10,000 people an average of 10 million each. So 10 million was like the going rate. And so we got the $10 million offer, which was like, the friendly one. It was like, and it usually works. Most inventors are there to try and get rich. That's what they're about, which I eventually learned. And so they just take the money and they're happy. And somehow their technology never gets developed, though. And this is, it's happened thousands of times. And this is, and again, there's a whole, over the years, in fact, Greer did a movie here a couple of years ago called The Lost Century. And then he rattled off 9. I misspoke earlier in other videos. And I said it was 8, but it was 9. He said there were 9 tactics of organized suppression. And 7 of them I lived through. And this was something, and this is something I will discuss at later dates, but it was something that, and when he rattled off those 9, and he already had credibility with me, but when he rattles off the 9 tactics and 7 of them I lived through, I'll buy that. And so this is how the people who run the world make sure that upstarts like us do not get to bring our pigs to market. And so this is something that is standard, and particularly with disruptive technologies, particularly with energy technologies. Anything close to free energy is going to get wiped out, bought out. And they also have, again, they've got technologies, anti-gravity, again, stuff I've heard from some of the people close to this. It's mind-blowing. And in fact, during my adventures, and this is going back over 30 years ago now, but one of my close associates was kidnapped back in the 90s and taken to an underground facility, and he was shown free energy, anti-gravity, and a whole host of technology that looked like a magic show. In fact, his eyes were bugging out of his head by the end of the demonstration. And he said, "You guys don't play in my galaxy." And anyway, this is one of the, I have to wait till more people die before I can be more forthcoming with a lot of this stuff, unfortunately. And Henry Kissinger, David Rockefeller, these people were also involved. And once they died, I was freed to reveal their identities. In fact, the hitman sicked on Dennis in Seattle, who caused a woman's death. One of the Dennis's employees died because of his activities. He died here this last summer. I named him. His name is Bill Delp, and he was a hitman for the electric companies and a corporate hitman. But he killed somebody. And I was like, this is part of what you do. Your hands get bloody when you're working for these people, but it pays well. And so it pays well for a while. I'm sure Bill's afterlife isn't too much fun right now. But anyway, so Bill Delp was a hitman, worked for the electric companies to wipe out any threat to their market supremacy. And so this is how capitalism really works. This is something, even Adam Smith, they wrote about this, is that wiping out the competition is the essence of capitalism. And so one of the great propaganda triumphs of capitalism is this notion of free markets. There aren't any free markets. There never have been free markets. It's an ideal that doesn't exist. Kind of like an idea of a free press or democracy, or a purely pursued scientific method. All these things are, ideals that to one extent or another have been corrupted. And this is the real world. And my basic message is, in a world of scarcity and fear, this is what happens. It gets corrupt. And so there's a select few that are highly organized that make sure the rest of us live in scarcity and fear, kind of like a steel cage match with each other, all grappling, trying to survive. And in fact, when I became Dennis's partner, well, again, so in Seattle, then I watched Dennis get his company stolen. And after I'd witnessed about 10 attempts to steal our companies, I told Dennis how shocking it was to see all these attempts by our associates to steal our companies. And he said, the first 50 times I saw it, I was shocked too. So And this is how it is. Not unusual. This is how the world works. And so, and this was again my greatest lesson I learned during those days is personal integrity is the world's scarcest commodity, and it's most precious though. And so it's a thing where, but it's extremely scarce. And I have a pantheon of my heroes. It's not a big one, but people whose conscience and heroic acts, speaking out, speaking the truth, daring to contradict the pronouncements of the system. So anyway, it's quite an adventure. And what happened was that my mentor, when I brought my mentor out to assess what we were doing in Boston, he basically told Dennis realized that this guy really was the Tesla that I said he was. And so Dennis wanted to work with him at all costs. And I didn't know it at the time. I didn't learn. In fact, they never told me. Actually, I read in one of Dennis's books later that we moved my hometown of Ventura, California, to be close to my mentor. So he'd be inventing and stuff, and Dennis would be taking that pig to market, etc. They didn't tell me that, which ended up costing me quite a bit in the end. But such is life. And so anyway, so we ended up in Ventura, California, and again, the Boston thing, we had a total media blackout, and in fact, they were sharpening their axes, the officials that were about ready to go after us, and we moved away before they could strike, which they later admitted. In fact, I've got these documents on my site, letters from the prosecutors say, yeah, we're about ready to criminally prosecute him, but we couldn't find any laws that are breaking. This is your public servants at work. And so anyway, went to Ventura, California, and Dennis found a program that worked, which was basically selling information kits on how to make, build and install that heating system to people. And it was like $2,000 for one kit or $5,000 for all three. And money started pouring in from around the country. Millions of dollars came in. And in fact, my mentor came forward with his engine. We were going after free energy, and it looked like we might have been able to deliver it. In fact, if we had been unmolested, we would have free energy today. And so, but we weren't. And so we got wiped out very harshly. We got a raid. The officials, the sheriff's deputies were gangsters, so you're basically the police and the prosecutors and the judges, they're all gangsters. And in fact, I didn't know it. I was raised there, but Ventura County regularly made the list of the most corrupt counties in the United States and regularly was named number one. And I didn't know that. The media, the newspapers wouldn't tell you that. And so until you run afoul of these people, you don't know. Actually, my father eventually told me that he heard about some of this kind of stuff before we had our ordeal. Where gangsters kind of ran the county, and that's something that I'll get into that more maybe a little later. But anyway, so what happened was that money was pouring in from around the country. In fact, an attorney from D.C. who actually knew Edwin Meese, who was the Attorney General of the United States at the time, and he actually asked him what he knew about Dennis and us, and he said, Dennis, we've investigated him thoroughly, more than once. He's squeaky clean. And he told Dennis, squeaky clean, as he hands him the $10,000 check. And so, but we get raided, and again, it was worst year of my life when all that happened. And in fact, when they cleaned my office out from the raid, I was the controller. I had all the records, and they took everything I had. And about 6 weeks later, I started going to a general stress-related physical collapse, and actually asked Dennis for the summer off so I could kind of recover by hiking. And he agreed. I had saved his bacon a few times already. And what happened was that a few weeks later, Dennis got a call from some bankers in Chicago. He goes and meets them. And that's another event that I didn't know about until I read it in one of Dennis's books. And he met with these bankers in Chicago, and they actually had a sit-down meeting with the guy from the CIA. And the guy from the CIA said he represented European interests, and they were prepared to pay $1 billion for Dennis to fold the operation. And in fact, I think the exact words were, "We'll put a one on the check, you put the zeros on the check." And Dennis, and again, 100 times the original offer, it turns out that was a pretty also standard tactic of these people. Yeah, protecting their, quadrillion-dollar world economy and investments. In fact, when I saw Dennis last month, I estimated they spent $1 trillion in keeping disruptive technologies that day, and Dennis said at least that much. And so anyway, they paid out $250 billion so far in these buyouts. That's chump change for the game these guys are playing, the guys who run the world. But anyway, so what happens is that Dennis made a counter offer, and he said, "That's a very interesting offer, and I think I'm going to take. I think I'll take the offer, but I'm going to a little term I want to negotiate here, which is you put the one on the check, I put the zeros on the check, but it goes back in your pocket and it's earmarked for bringing free energy to the world. How about that?" And the CIA guy kind of chokes on his soup, and he said he wasn't empowered to accept that offer for the European interests that he was representing. Yeah, the CIA guy was just an errand boy for these global elite people. And so anyway, what happened was that a couple weeks later, he said, "Dennis, I'm in town. I want to come see you." And Dennis had dinner with the guy. And about 2 weeks later, Dennis was arrested with $1 million bail. And that was all the worst year of my life. And it's a total nightmare. I went bankrupt that year. That was the easy part. That was the easiest part of my year was going bankrupt. Everything else was just a complete nightmare. And in fact, yeah, and so promotions are handed around. I mean, literally, people got all their hands bloody, all the corrupt officials, judgeships, promotions, all this stuff. And in fact, the CIA guy, my guess is that when the CIA guy visited Dennis, he was also arranging for Dennis's subsequent treatment by greasing palms. So 10 million under the table, that's pretty cheap. And it says, instead of $1 billion to go away, we'll spend $10 million on corrupt officials to take you out. And they did. And so anyway, and then also there was a Mormon hitman infiltrated in the organization in Ventura also. In fact, I've named him because he went to prison, so he's essentially defanged. A guy named Ken Hodgel. In fact, he was the world's largest potato grower at one time. But anyway, and he was another Mormon provocateur. And in fact, when I heard Greer in 2004 talk about the global elite and who runs the show, he said the Mormon financial empire was the ringleader at that time. They probably are today. Anyway, when he said that, I was like, isn't that interesting? Because Mormons stole both of Ventura and Seattle companies. And so anyway, this was, yeah, I had so many those kind of moments during my journey where it all comes together eventually with the piece of information. Oh, that's what was going on. And so anyway, and what happened was that again, the officials were so corrupt. I mean, so evil-minded, and they threatened anybody who could testify to the technologies, etc. Chased people into hiding. Again, it was a total nightmare. I was only 20. I was 30 years old at the time, and they were. I wasn't going to back down. In fact, it turns out my professor, who I took the voice in my head told me to go into business. He became my professor my first year of accounting studies, and he was the best professor I ever had. In fact, I went to university and immediately was setting record test scores at the university because of his education, by and large. And so we became partners, and that was the thing. We became partners. Long and crazy story. And the man was a saint. And what happened was that he and I were the only people there who were not going to flee, et cetera. We did what we could to save Dennis's life by that time. I didn't care about the business any longer. I just cared about saving Dennis's life. And so and they were going to make sure he would never live to see this side of the bars again. That's what they were going for. And lying. I mean, I watched criminals, again, prosecutors, sheriff's deputies, they're a bunch of gangsters, it's just like, until you've been targeted by them, it's hard to believe. But yeah, these people are just gangsters. And they don't care. In fact, one of the prosecutors eventually admitted he didn't care if Dennis was innocent or not. He didn't care. All he cared about was getting conviction. and admitted he had lied as much as he needed to get a conviction. In fact, the same year he said that, he was the first president of the Southern California Fraud Investigators Association, believe it or not. And I write about this stuff on my site, etc. So yeah, so on Earth, you may have temporal, secular success, but your afterlife's pretty rough. You engage in those kind of activities. So anyway, what happened was my moment of truth was my day on the witness stand in November of 1988. And in fact, the deputy who led the raid, who started the so-called investigation, led the raid. He was the assistant of the prosecutor during the preliminary hearing, and he sat in front of me, about 20 feet in front of me, directly in front of me, which I later learned was no accident. And my day on the witness stand, he was making faces at me and making all these wild theatrical gestures while I was testifying. This is my first time kind of on a witness stand. I'd hardly ever been in a courtroom before that. And he was acting like, I mean, his antics wouldn't have lasted in a fifth grade classroom for 10 seconds. But I was in kangaroo court. So the judge, it was acceptable for him to try to intimidate me as I was testifying. Anyway, that was the wake up call of my lifetime. In fact, I see my life as before that day and after that day. I would never see the world the same way again after that day on the witness stand. And the next month was the worst month of my life, blackest month of my life. I was being betrayed, going bankrupt. People were in hiding. It was a total nightmare. And Dennis, they threw Dennis. In fact, the guy who arrested Dennis got promoted to be in charge of the jail, a couple of weeks later, with Dennis's $1 million bill, which was astronomical at the time, way higher than anybody else in the whole jail system. And they were trying to break Dennis in jail. In fact, Dennis, so they tried on the wrong guy. So Dennis tried to throw a Christmas party for his inmates. And anyway, they used Dennis's throwing a Christmas party. They cited some infraction of some rule, and they threw him in solitary confinement for a month for trying to throw a Christmas party for his inmates. This is the kind of people that they were. And anyway, and so then the next, I actually wanted to kill people, which was the lowest part of my journey was actually seeing myself killing people involuntarily. It was like, I didn't want these thoughts in my head. And so anyway, but by the end of the year that I'd gotten over it, and I decided I was going to do whatever I could to get Dennis out of jail. In fact, Dennis, my professor by that time had taken in Dennis's wife and children and his daughters. They lived with them for a couple of years. And so what happened was I went, by that time I was working in Los Angeles again at this medical lab. The funny thing is, as soon as I started working at this medical lab, the government and the media tried to take them out too. I was getting at the same time, I was getting the energy racket and the medical racket attacking my companies at the same time. And so that was, again, there's no accident. So my otherworldly friends were giving me both barrels of how this world really works. And so what happened though was I went to my professor's home after work one day, and I asked Dennis's wife what I could do. What can I do to get Dennis out of jail? And she gave me a book. And this book was by a guy who was a policeman, who had been a policeman in Ventura. In fact, he was an LAPD cop originally in 1946. And he bounced back and forth between Ventura County and Los Angeles over his career. And in 1970, he was rolled out of his career because he refused to frame people, take bribes and frame people, which actually one of the guys in my neighborhood took those bribes. And I've written about this somewhere. It's like his children were dressed very fashionably. Yeah, they were an anomaly kind of in our neighborhood because they were all this money they somehow come into to live quite high on the hog, and it turns out it was bribe money. He was taking bribes that were more than his annual salary, and bribes to frame people for the gangsters around Ventura County to get people out of the way for real estate boondoggles and these kinds of things, and drug running. And so, yeah, the judges control the drug trade there in Ventura County, which I later learned that's standard. Every county is like that. There's just so much money in the illegal drug trade. It corrupts everything. And so anyway, I read this book by this policeman, and he named names. He named the names of the children the fathers of children I went to school with and stuff, friends with, etc. And their fathers were involved in taking my friend out, whose name was Gary Wing. He was a policeman, and but when he refused to frame people, they were railroads were not his career. But Gary didn't take it lying down. He fought back and kept fighting. In fact, he wrote a book about his adventures. In fact, published it in '87, the year before. And so I read his book and then met with him. Really, we met across the street from the jail. And anyway, I asked Gary, I said, what can I do? Is there a senator's doorstep I can camp out? What can I do? And Gary gave me the best advice I could have gotten, which was nobody will help. He said, nobody's going to help you. Yeah, they're all in the same club. And he said, what's going on right now with Dennis happens all over the United States all the time. It's a very lawless society. Again, gangsters essentially run societies. In fact, gangsters run everything really. And it's like, and they're not all mafia, Italian types, but it's like, again, back to personal integrity is the world's scarcest commodity. So our systems are run by the corrupt, and the people who run the world are the most corrupt, and then the people who run the world, nobody knows who they are. Again, Mormon financial empire, the Gurnet empire, the Jesuit order, but the rest of them, nobody knows who they are. But these are the people who control the world economy. There's like 7 cartels that control the world economy, which in the interview I did, they asked me to give them off: energy, medicine, military intelligence, banking, organized religion. I leave one out. Let's turn it. Let me do it again. Energy, medicine, military intelligence, organized religion, banking. That's 6. There's a 7th one. I can't believe I'm blanking on it. But anyway, these they're all interlocked at the top, and they control the world economy, and energy is the kingpin. And so anything that's going to upset the energy racket is taken out. And this is where the friendly buyout offers and stuff. So I would estimate that of that 100 billion that Greer was told about, which is I'm sure is a $250 billion by now, most of that was disruptive energy technologies, including free energy technology. And so anyway, what happened was that when Gary told me, he basically said, you're gonna have to take them on yourself. It's like, nobody's gonna help you, you gotta do it yourself. And so what happened was that over the next month, I conceived a strategy, because the company was wiped out. Dennis he was back to defending himself. And what happened in solitary confinement with the guy who arrested him being in charge of his treatment, etc. All this, stuff. If they made a movie, nobody would believe it, And so anyway, what happens is that Gary, that advice, I went to Mr. Professor and I asked him to mortgage his house and create a $50,000 legal fund for me, which is twice my annual salary. But and I knew I was throwing my life away to do this, but I said, Dennis needs some representation. And if we can get experts to testify to the reality of these technologies, because they were wiping out all the test data, again, it's amazing what they can do. And so, yeah, they're trying to say that you didn't have a heat pump that worked, And so anyway, I thought if we could get experts to testify to the technologies, that it would work. I'm going to pause for a second. Be right back. Okay, I'm back. So anyway, I was trying to, and I didn't think I would be successful. I thought that maybe I was giving Dennis a 2% chance, 1% chance that he would live to see this side of the bars again. In fact, Dennis was writing the book of his life story, and in the book he was predicting that he would not live to see this side of the bars again. And again, the officials they use the inmates to murder you. This is also standard. In California, this is a standard. In fact, they had there's a term, I think, called death by inmate or something. So anyway, in fact, they almost did. So Dennis barely survived his experiences behind bars. But anyway, so what happened was that I went to my professor and he agreed. He and his wife agreed they'd mortgage their house and create a legal fund for me for dentists that would pay off over the next umpteen years. And anyway, and so we did. Well, anyway, dentists, we all realized that was actually an act of divine intervention. What happened next was that suddenly dentists started winning motions. And in fact, and then the officials got caught committing crimes, admitted they were opening his legal mail, etc., which is, that's the sort of sacrosanct client attorney privilege. They were violating that. In fact, more than one. In fact, the second time they did it, that's when Dennis got out miraculously, going from $1 million bail to released on his own recognizance. And again, that was the biggest miracle I'd ever seen. Again, 6 weeks after I did that, Dennis was out of jail. And at that point, I knew that he'd be okay. But still, and we got the leading constitutional attorney in the United States to defend him. And he got the education of his life because it was all dirty. I mean, it's so corrupt, so dirty. And in fact, they eventually in fact, in Seattle, the attorney general took Dennis's customers hostage to get Dennis to do a plea settlement, a civil settlement, basically because one person in the whole state of Washington state misunderstood one thing Dennis said. That's what they got Dennis on in Seattle. And then the media, again, he's been smeared in the media ever since because one person in the state misunderstood one thing he said. And so, in fact, they said it didn't matter if Dennis intended to deceive him or not. It didn't matter. It's just that one person misunderstood one thing you said, then we got you. And then in California, what happened was eventually what Dennis got convicted of was he didn't file a form and pay $50, which was actually my job. In fact, I'd heard about this law in other states, and I didn't think it applied to us, so I didn't file the form. And Dennis spent 2 years behind bars for not filing a form. And the officials repeatedly tried to get him murdered by the inmates, and it almost worked. Dennis got lucky; he only had some fingers broken and teeth knocked out. And anyway, it's a long, crazy story. And so anyway, but yeah, Dennis gets out and he immediately starts trying to rebuild it with Mr. Professor. And by that time, I told Dennis, I don't care. I didn't believe in the businessman's path of this any longer. I saw what it was up against, and not just from the organized suppression, et cetera, but the dozens of attempts to steal our companies by our own business associates, et cetera. It was just, it wouldn't work. Capitalist approach won't work for this. And that was the big lesson I took away from that. And so anyways, I really didn't believe in that approach any longer, which led me to what I'm doing today, which is my approach today, which I'm calling the love and enlightenment, a path to free energy and a world of abundance and a healed humanity and planet. And so anyway, when I busted Dennis out of jail, my heroics were over, and I just then started picking up the pieces of my broken life. And in fact, got married the next year, moved away to Ohio, put my wife through grad school, and Dennis kept trying to get me to go back to work for him. And eventually, unfortunately, I did back in 96, 97. We were subjected to a huge sting operation, which I almost went to prison from that one. But I eventually was able to come back home to Seattle, and I haven't left. I don't plan to. And so anyway, so what happened was I staggered out of my hometown in 1990, thoroughly radicalized. And I realized that whatever I've been taught about how the world works isn't how the world works. And I started my years of study, which was several years later, I began writing publicly, and which is the bulk of my work today. And so, the adventures that I had and what we learned was important, but what I have to offer is a way to get there. But I need people that are like me, disillusioned idealists. And that's what I call them, and that's my shorthand for them. Basically, Boy and Girl Scouts who are idealists who went into the world thinking they were going to make the world a better place, make a dent. And I don't care if you're a priest or CIA or a cop or a teacher or whatever. And what happens is that if you have your eyes open, you'll eventually realize how corrupt it all is and how the ideals that you signed up for don't really exist, whatever it is. And so any human endeavor, none of them are as they are properly presented. They're all corrupt, and you don't learn this unless you have your eyes open and you get involved and you start pursuing your ideals, and eventually it's like going to Oz, and eventually you pull that curtain and you see the guy behind the curtain and you realize it was all a scam. And so anyway, I'm working for people like that who because only people like that have what I'll call awakened, which mean and but what I mean by awakened is that you realize that your indoctrination and conditioning wasn't indoctrination and conditioning. It wasn't about the truth. It wasn't about really making the world a better place. It was about serving people's self-interest, at the expense of the whole. And unfortunately, almost everybody does it, and it's like, and people don't want to know, in future sessions like this, I'll go into depth on all these issues. But anyway, so I began my days of study, etc. And again, in those days, I really started understanding the free energy community a lot better, started meeting other people in the field. I met a lot of them during my days with Dennis, but I met a lot more also. Again, Brian O'Leary, I met him the year after I left my hometown. We became colleagues eventually. And Brian was just getting his feet wet in the free energy field. And in fact, if there was a spokesman for the free energy field, it was Brian. And I eventually became Brian's biographer. And I started studying all sorts of material. And this is something I'll discuss in the future. But what I didn't know what I was doing was I was developing a comprehensive perspective, which I really had been doing since childhood, but I never heard it called that. And I really didn't, I was just a learning junkie. So I want to learn everything. And so it's a thing where I come to, year after I did my second website, one of Bucky Fuller's pupils contacted me, interacted with me, and he called me a comprehensivist, and I didn't know what he meant. And he had me read some of Fuller's work. And when I read a couple of Fuller's books, the light bulb went on. Finally, okay, I see what I've been doing. And my work's been consciously comprehensive ever since. And in fact, over 20 years ago, I resumed my science studies. And so most of my work today is science and scholarship. And my adventures, though, it's important to the extent of understanding kind of how a lot of what the public is taught about how the world works isn't that way at all. And again, in many areas, and in fact, in all areas probably. And so, the people making an honest living are picking our beans. The rest of us, not such an honest living. And this is what you learn. I learned this the hard way over many years. And so anyway, but I think that if I find enough people who can learn what I call the song of abundance, gain a constant perspective, but they have to be these disillusioned idealists with the heart's in the right place, and they had to already awakened. You can't awaken through reading somebody's material, watching YouTube clips. That's not how you awaken. You only awaken through experience. And so these idealists who went into all these vocations with these idealistic aspirations to eventually wake up to where what they were sold is not the reality. Those are the people I'm looking for, because those are the people I think who can join with me, and we can make it happen. It wouldn't take that many people. I've set a goal of 5,000 people who can do this, and 5,000 people are able to engage in a public conversation at a global level, which is what I'm trying to mount. The global elite would not be able to stop it, because the greatest triumph of the global elite is making the world that I am arguing for unimaginable, impossible, all these kind of things. So it's totally off people's radar. They don't even think in those terms. And so when people don't even think about making the world better in these ways, job's done. I mean, everybody's just sitting there, gnawing at the shards of their scarcity-based bones they eat every day, et cetera. And they're not really trying to make a dent in a way that's really going to make a dent. And so, and again, a lot of my heroes, Ed Hermans, Noam Chomsky, the Sam Husseini's, they all did good work. They all did the best they could. And these are my heroes. And also, though, it's like, but the energy issue is the biggest one on Earth. It's the one where humanity is going to either ascend to the next, what I call epic, or we're going to meet our demise with our own hands based on the energy issue. And this is something that my work's about this. And so this is something that in future sessions, I will get into that in a fair amount of detail. In fact, eventually a great amount of detail. And so anyway, and Dennis is still at it. I saw him last month. He's still trying to make a dent in his own way. I've never met anybody like him, never heard anybody like him. He's only one, he's a one-off, definitely. And but I'm trying to do my own thing. I'm trying to do something that I didn't see anybody trying this. And so I thought it was worth my life to try it out, you know, and I can't regret any of it. You know, it's been a good life, been a good run. I'm 67 now. Hopefully I have 20 or 30 more good years in me, and what I'm doing will bear fruit. And so this is the first video that I've made along these lines. And I think there'll be many more to come, and we'll see if Google or YouTube will continue to host these. I hope so. I'm probably going to post a Rumble and maybe other places to make sure that it will survive on the internet. So we'll see. Anyway, so that's how long was that? An hour 10, I guess. And so the first of many. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching. Bye.